To show you a photo, just one, because sometimes one photo is all it takes to get to the heart, as it were, of the issue. This was the famous photo, for instance, that showed a young girl running terrified down a street in Vietnam that galvanized Middle America against that war. And who can forget this photo of the dead boy on the beach several years ago that led to the throwing open of Europe's doors to millions of refugees? The reason these photos are so powerful, of course, is because they trigger an emotional rather than a rational response, which is why the media and the left-wing propagandists love them. So much easier to tug at the heartstrings than to offer up fact, reason and logic. Currently, a war is raging in Israel, and here is the photo that tells you everything you need to know about the history and the future of this conflict. This is what is called the Iron Dome at work in the skies above Israel. On the right-hand side of the photo, you can see the deadly rockets being fired out of Gaza in an aggressive and deliberately offensive act of war, designed to kill and maim as many innocent, everyday Israeli citizens as possible. Those rockets, by the way, have been supplied by Iran, funded in part by the Obama-Biden administration, and indeed by countries such as ours via our donations to the United Nations. Now, on the left-hand side of the photo, looking like something out of Star Wars or Close Encounters, you can see the Iron Dome, a technological miracle that allows Israel to shoot those Iranian and Hamas rockets out of the sky in a purely defensive act designed to save citizens' lives. Now, allow that to tug on the logical side of your brain rather than tug at the emotional strings of your heart. On the right-hand side, a barrage of deadly missiles supplied by the terrorist Iranian regime to the murderous thugs of Hamas, designed to kill Jewish men, women and children as they sleep in their beds. On the left-hand side, a highly sophisticated and remarkable defensive system designed through ingenuity and necessity over many long years to protect lives. That is the story of the Gaza conflict and the history of Israel and Palestine. Pretty much everything else you will hear is obfuscation, distortion and lies, including this insidious rubbish that the Palestinians are the victims courtesy of the pernicious moral relativism of the left, peddled incessantly by the mainstream media and spouted by fools such as the creepy former leader of Pink Floyd, Roger Waters.
Unless some pressure is brought to bear upon the Israeli government to stop their ferocious, murderous attack on Gaza.
What rubbish. Of course, this disgraceful performance by Adam Bolton on Sky News in London, interviewing the Israeli ambassador, Tzipi Hotovely, takes the
United Nations, its duty to say that Hamas is committing a double war crimes. Right. One war crime is they're shooting from civilian areas, and the other one they're shooting to civilians. So they're committing double war crimes.
As you well know, the United Nations has repeatedly said that the settlements are illegal in international law and should cease, and those are continuing.
But they need to condemn terror organization, which is recognized by Britain and by the United States, that is now shooting into civilian
all
population.
I'm saying is a bit rich to say the United Nations should do something when Israel is ignoring what the United Nations has said in the context of settlements.
Can I ask you something? What would you do if Britain was under a fire? What would you do if London was under fire and rockets were thrown on your house? What would you do? Do you think Britain would have sat silent, not protecting its citizens? Do you expect any sovereign country not to protect its citizens?
Of course you can protect citizens. The question is the retaliation and the attacking of civilians in Gaza and elsewhere, which, as we know, once again is leading to disproportionate suffering on the Palestinian side.
Disproportionate, settlements. So just to be clear, in the eyes of the woke left, Israel should sit back silently and allow its citizens to be blown to smithereens by rockets and bombs because of complicated historical reasons. There are some disputed Jewish settlements out in Judea and Samaria on land that, by the way, for over 3,500 years has been the home of the Jews. That's your lefty logic. Oh, and if Hamas fires thousands of deadly rockets into the suburbs of Tel Aviv, if imams call for Israeli Muslims to rush out and buy cheap 5-shekel knives to slit the throats of their Jewish neighbours alongside whom they have lived peacefully for decades, as they have done, if synagogues are burnt to the ground, oh, that's all hunky-dory. But it is disproportionate. What a vile word, disproportionate of Israel to defend its people. How dare the Israeli government stop Jews being killed? Well, may Adam Bolton hang his head in shame. But it got even worse.
The two-state solution cannot be possible so long as the settlement program continues and the claiming of East Jerusalem, can it?
Look at Gaza. Hamas is shooting from Gaza. No settlements in Gaza, as you know, because Israel withdrew in 2005. What was the result? More radicals took over, and they're shooting rockets on the heart of Israel. They're shooting rockets on Tel Aviv. Do you think Tel Aviv is a settlement?
So, apparently in the eyes of the left, the fact that Gaza was given to the Palestinians as their own independent, self-governing land, and they've since it was given to them, they've repeatedly used that generous gift simply to attack Israel. That is proof that Israel is doing something wrong. This is lefty lunacy on steroids with deadly consequences. But what sparked this latest conflict? Put simply, the Iranians are taking advantage of the weak Biden administration, testing it, and at the same time, a power struggle is being played out between those deadly foes, Hamas, Palestinian Jihad, and the Palestinian authorities, following Abbas cancelling elections in the West Bank because everybody knew he was finished and Hamas would win. That's the fuel, but the spark was provided, as both Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo have pointed out, by the Biden administration's antipathy towards Israel, which I spoke about here on Outsiders only the other day, including denigrating Trump's brilliant Abraham Accords, which saw a plethora of peace treaties between Israel and Arab states such as Saudi Arabia. Under Trump, you had peace in the Middle East. Yes, under Trump, you had peace in the Middle East. Under Biden and Harris, you have war, as I and others predicted. But back to Bolton, merely mouthpiece of the left.
Asking you about Israel, is Mr. Netanyahu exploiting this political crisis? As we know, he's only the acting prime minister because of inconclusive elections. He's worried about losing office because of possible prosecutions he might face, and that whipping up a security situation or allowing a very dangerous security situation to take place may be simply a cynical way of saving himself.
All political leaders in Israel today want Israel to respond to Hamas aggression and to Hamas attacks on Israeli civilians, because this is what every country would have done.
Not in the way that is going on.
No, in a way. Actually, some people say we're being too gentle. Some people say we're being too gentle.
What a repulsive comment, that it is Benjamin Netanyahu who is whipping up the violence for political purpose. This is sheer Orwellian madness. Meanwhile, I happen to agree with Ambassador Hotovelli. I think Israel is far too gentle, only because it's been so browbeaten by its own lovies and cowards and moral relativists and leftists in the UN and elsewhere. No other country would be so generous to those who wish to annihilate them. In my opinion, Israel should do, and I suspect will do, what any other sensible nation would do: take back Gaza and wipe out Hamas. Forget the endless hand-wringing and the frankly anti-Semitic Israel bashing and Jew hatred that permeates our mainstream media, the ABC, Labour, the Greens and the left. The story of the last 70 years of Israel is summed up in this one photo: a small, technologically advanced democracy constantly having to defend itself from vicious assault sponsored by the Arab regimes and Islamist fanatics that surround it, encouraged and funded by globalist bodies like the United Nations and the European Union and the neo-Marxists of the West. Time and time again, Israeli leaders have offered land and peace to the Palestinians and have been viciously knocked back at every turn, even when they have defended themselves from the invading Arab armies. Israel has then handed back the land that it needed to take to defend itself. Foolishly, in my opinion. I wouldn't have. They should have kept the lot. And the irony: Those missiles attacking Israel from the right of that picture are being launched from the very ground that Israel handed over to the Palestinians at enormous personal cost to thousands of Jews and their families in order to create an atmosphere of trust and to bring about peace with the Palestinians. How tragically naive and ironic. As Ted Cruz pointed out this week, we are on the verge of a shooting war in the Middle East thanks to the policies of the American left led by Joe Biden.
Very concerned. Hamas is raining rockets down on the people of Israel. They're doing it with the financial support and backing of Iran, of the Ayatollah Khamenei. And this is the result of foreign policy mistakes, enormous blunders by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. You know, you think about it, the last 4 years, President Trump stood strongly with Israel, unequivocally with Israel. We moved our embassy to Jerusalem, something I urged the president to do, and he agreed with me and did. And it produced this oasis of peace. We saw the Abraham Accords. We saw Arabs and Israelis making peace agreements together for the first time in decades. What happened? Joe Biden comes in, immediately begins undermining Israel, immediately begins sending hundreds of millions of dollars to the Palestinian Authority, to Hamas, the terrorists there, immediately begins negotiation to send billions of dollars to the Ayatollah Khamenei, who regularly chants death to America and death to Israel. And it is producing, we are on the verge of a shooting war in the Middle East because Joe Biden and Kamala Harris undermine our friends and want to send money to our enemies.
Or, as Mike Pompeo, who has appeared here on Outsiders, succinctly put it, it matters who leads. As Donald Trump said this week, when Trump was in office, Israel's adversaries knew that the United States stood strongly with Israel and there would be swift retribution if Israel was attacked. Under Biden, the world is getting more violent and more unstable. And, says Trump, America must always stand with Israel and make clear that the Palestinians must end the violence, terror and rocket attacks and make clear that the US will always strongly support Israel's right to defend itself. That was Trump speaking. Anyone who tells you otherwise, anyone who tries to pin the blame for this tragedy on Israel, anyone who bangs on about Israel being the oppressor and being some evil apartheid state, such as we saw yesterday at the pro-Palestinian rallies in Sydney and Melbourne, is a dangerous fool and almost certainly an anti-Semite. For decades now, the Palestinian people have suffered at the hands of and been betrayed by their own leaders, encouraged repulsively by the United Nations, the European Union, and obscene amounts of cash from countries such as ours. The Palestinian people themselves have been mercilessly exploited for decades by a succession of Arab dictators, murderous Islamists, and fanatical terror groups who have never lifted a finger to seek genuine peace. In fact, quite the opposite. The Biden administration is desperate to create a Palestinian state, no matter who runs it. But how can Israel ever agree to a two-state solution with people who have sworn in their charter to wipe them off the face of the earth? What's worse, Hamas, who are in a sick competition with the Palestinian Authority to see who can kill more Jews, were no doubt emboldened by those hardcore leftists around the West, including, disgracefully, our own Labour Party, who only a couple of weeks ago loudly proclaimed that the next Australian Labour government will unconditionally recognise a Palestinian state. Unconditionally. Well, we can now see what unconditionally looks like. This, in part, is your Palestinian state, Labour. You helped embolden it. I hope you sleep better in your beds at night than the children cowering under the covers in Lod and Sderot.